kapara bein l'chaim bein l'mesim, and that is actually the earliest makor for saying Yizkor on Yom Kippur. So apparently the Yizkor of Yom Kippur was earlier than the Yizkor for the Sholosh Regalim, which came later. Because Yom Kippur was a kapara even for the Mesim. The obvious question is, why do Mesim need a kapara? I mean, whatever sins they committed, and after they die, they're judged. Why do they need a continuous kapara? But the answer is, Rav Chaim Volozhiner says, that the idea is that a person's life has many ripple effects that continue afterwards. So, for example, you raised your child to be a religious person, then all the mitzvos they do go to your credit. If chas v'shalom they go off the derech because of something you did, you get all the averos. So every year, HaKadosh Baruch Hu reevaluates where a person is holding, and that might mean an aliyah, or it might be a yerida. So Yom Kippur is a kapara for the averos for which there might be a yerida. So that's the Medrash Tanchuma, that Yom Kippur is a lashon rabim because of kapara for the chayim and for the mesim. But the Arizal says that the plural is not really a plural, but you read it like Kippurim, that Yom Kippur is a day like Purim, which implies, in other words, Purim is higher than Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur is a day like Purim. So the question is, of course, if you had to pick 2 days in the calendar that are least similar, you might pick Yom Kippur and Purim, a very, very different types of days. So in what way would Yom Kippur be a higher madrega than Purim? Would Purim be a higher madrega than Yom Kippur? So the emes is this. The emes is that Yom Kippur is also a day of Kabbalah of Torah. Because Moshe Rabbeinu went up on Har Sinai after the Aseret Dibros. He went up on Har Sinai for 40 days. He came down on Shivos Or B'Tammuz, and that's when he broke the Luchos Rishonos. Then he went up a second time to be Mispalel, etc. We're going to read it in this parsha. But then the final time he went up, the third time, was Rosh Chodesh Elul. And he came down on Yom Kippur with the Luchos Shniyos. So Yom Kippur is the Gemar of the Kabbalah of Torah of Shavuos. And Yom Kippur and Shavuos, right? Shavuos was the Aseret Dibros, and Matan Torah was Nimshach until Yom Kippur. Now we know that the Matan Torah of Shavuos came through a certain element of coercion. Hashem held the mountain over our heads. So it turns out that the Kabbalah of Torah of Yom Kippur, which is a continuation of the Kabbalah of Torah of Shavuos, came through Kefiyah, Yira. Hashem said, if you're makabel the Torah, that's good. If not, I'm going to crush you. Purim, Chazal say, as a result of being saved, Kiyamu v'kiblu, we accepted upon ourselves what we had previously accepted. We accepted out of love what we had previously accepted out of fear. So it turns out that Purim is Kabbalah Torah Me'ava. Yom Kippur is Kabbalah Torah Me'yira. And since Ava is higher than Yira, so on that level, Purim is a higher level of Kabbalah Torah than even Yom Kippur. Right? And that's the idea of Yom Kippurim. Yom Kippur is like Purim, that it's Kabbalah Torah, but Purim is a higher madrega because it's a Kabbalah Torah Me'ava. Now, the emes is on that whole sugya that Hashem held the mountain over our heads, and we were forced into it. So Taisus asked the kasha, how can we say we were forced into it? The Jewish people said, Naaseh v'nishma, whatever Hashem says, we will do, even before we know what it is. And they're praised precisely because they voluntarily said Naaseh v'nishma. So Tosas's answer is, Eino chinami, Avada, we were makabel the Torah willingly, but because of the pachad, the thunder and the lightning and all of those things, we were going to change our mind, so the kefiyah was to be sure we don't change our mind. That's what Taisus says. But the emes is, there's another Medrash Tanchum. It's a pella that Taisus didn't bring it, because Taisus, the Balei Taisus is not one person, of course. The Balei Taisus certainly had the Medrash Tanchuma. The Medrash Tanchuma is mentioned in Taisus a number of places. So it's a pella that Taisus in Shabbos that asks the kasha, how can you say they were forced into it? They said Naaseh v'nishma. The Medrash Tanchuma asks the very same kasha. And the Medrash Tanchuma gives an interesting teretz. The Medrash Tanchuma says that Naseh B'Nishma goes on the Torah Shebechsav. The Torah Shebechsav we accepted willingly because that has a lot of flexibility. Don't do work on Shabbos. Oh, I'll go to the movies, I'll go to the beach, I won't go to my office on Shabbos. Torah Shebal Peh is more chomor with the Lamites Malachas and all of these different inyanim. So Tosfos says the Naseh V'Nishma is on the Torah Shebechsav, and the Kaf Aleim Har Kegigas, he held a mountain over their heads like a mountain, is going on Torah Shebal Peh. Now the emes is, the Medrash Tanchum is Taka Shver, because what value? I mean, it's mashma from the pasuk. There was some value in their acceptance. To accept a Torah Shebechsav without a Torah Shebal Peh, it's hard to even understand what is the value of that, because it's just wrong. I mean, you're not accepting Hashem's Torah. You're accepting something fake. I mean, what's shaykh to say? You know, if a person were to say, I accept, 20 mitzvahs and not the rest, at least you could say they accepted 20 mitzvahs. But when you say, I accept the Torah as it's written, and I don't accept the way the Torah Shebal interprets it, it's hard to see why that counts for anything at all. But as I state in Medrash Tanchuma, so it turns out that if Purim is accepting out of love what we had previously accepted out of fear, what do you see? The Iker Kabbalah of Torah of Purim is Torah Shebal Peh, because that is what we did out of love. So I used to have this complaint when I was cynical. I guess I'm cynical, but in yeshiva, somehow every single Yom Tov is connected Torah Shebal Peh. I don't know why. Like Rosh Hashanah is connected Torah Shebal Peh, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, Shmini. Somehow, in the yeshiva world, like every Yom Tov is always the same thing. It's Torah Shebal Peh. And sometimes it's a stretch. I mean, there are inyanim in Ruchnius that are not necessarily a Torah Shebal Peh. There are other things in God's pantheon. But the emes is, Purim, Taka does have directly a thematic connection. So here, right, where they say a stopped clock is the right time at least twice a day. So here, Taka, when the shmooze wants to connect to Shebal Peh, here Taka is emes. That Purim has a very, very close yesod to the union of Torah Shebal Peh, because the kimu v'kiblu is mechuvan keneged Torah Shebal Peh. So that's just a little bit of a hakdama. Okay, so now we're in the Evan Shelaima. 1 second here. Yeah, we're proceeding slowly but surely. Yeah, we're in the middle of Dalet. No, we did Dalet. We did Dalet. This is Perek Aleph, Sif Dalet. And you'll remember that the Gemara says that in Ruchnius, you have to find the path that works for you, even if other people think it's a strange thing. Meaning you find the path that brings you closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So, for example, you daven longer, you do different things, and people might look at it as funny or strange. But it's an important idea in Avodas Hashem that you don't let people's mockery dissuade you from doing good things. But the Gemara says, he does emphasize at the end, that even though you have to find your own path in spirituality, it must be mugdar by halacha, because that's a very big nisayon. Again, this is, you might think this is common sense, but these were controversial issues, because sometimes in a person's she'ifa, a person's yearning for ruchnius, they might feel that the halacha is restricting them, that the halacha is limiting them, that they need to kind of go beyond the halacha in order to, or not beyond, but keneged the halacha, in order to serve Hashem. So there's only one example given here. For example, a person wants to fast on Shabbos, because fasting, he feels closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but the halacha is you're not supposed to fast on Shabbos. So what's shaykh to say, I want to do something keneged the halacha? Now, I had mentioned last week, this was the last thing I had mentioned, that one practical issue that comes up a lot is tefillah b'tzibur. And that is, it's often going to be the case that a person might feel that they could have more kavanah davening b'yechidus than going to a minyan. That could be for a lot of reasons. Number one, a minyan might be faster than they need. Or, by the way, a minyan might be too slow. You have to recognize, we always assume that tefillah b'kavana equals davening slow. That's lav dafka. In Ger, there was a big Masorah. The Ger Rebbe davened like in a super fast Shemona Esrei, because that way the mind doesn't wander. I mean, sometimes you think Baruch. When you stretch out a word too long, you lose concentration. Sometimes the enthusiasm of tefillah is like a fire. So whatever it is, in other words, the minyan might be too slow, the minyan might be too fast. I don't feel I can express myself if I'm next to other people, right? So I can cry or whatever it is when I'm by myself. So a lot of people might feel at various times that they can have more kavana if they daven b'yechidus. Now the question becomes, the Gemara tells us here that a person should find his own derech in avodas Hashem, and he shouldn't be influenced by other people making fun of him, but it has to be within the getter of the halacha. So that gets us into the issue, is davening with a minyan a chiyuv, or is davening with a minyan a good thing, but it's not necessarily a chiyuv? Again, this is machlekes rishonim really, but in terms of modern poskim, Rav Chaim Kanievsky says many, many times that davening with a minyan is a chiyuv. He actually learns it's a chiyuv, not just an eitz tova. L'chayra, if it's a chiyuv, there wouldn't be a makam to make a cheshbon. I do better be a chidus. It's a chiyuv, and like the Gemara says, you can't be soymech on your seichel to go keneged the halacha. Masha ein kain, like other poskim who say that tefillah b'tzibor is a good thing, meaning it's an inyan choshev, because you have the schus of the tzibor. At least at that level, one could make a cheshbon that at least sometimes yechidus might be okay. Now it's interesting that I told you, I think from the Chazon Ish, who's Rav Chaim Kanievsky's uncle and Rav Chaim Kanievsky's Rebbe, that the Chiddush B'davka told a person that he could, he said once a month, it wasn't all the time, once a month he could daven b'yechidus if he was ma'arer his kavanah. So it's interesting, the Chazon Ish did give a certain leniency. I'm not sure if Rav Chaim would have been maskim to that or not. But this is an interesting shikol that people have. People have this issue. Now, the one thing, though, that is daicha tefillah b'tzibur, it's interesting, is tefillah kavasikin. This already is brought down in halacha. And that is, if a person was makabel on themselves to daven vasikin, right? What's vasikin? In other words, you want to start Shemona Esrei exactly with sunrise, right? Im hanetzach chama. So it's brought down that if you're koveya, that you're going to daven vasikin every day, and there's no minyan, that is going to be docha tefillah b'tzibur. But even that only applies if you daven kavua. In other words, if I happen to get up early one day, and there's no minyan, and I want to daven kavasikin, that I would not have a heter to miss tefillah b'tzibur. But if I do it b'ayfen kavua, there is such a thing. I'd also mentioned Rav Chaim's surprising psak, that if you didn't have your hat, not just your jacket, you didn't have your hat, and you had to miss minyan, he says you daven b'yechidus, daven later with your hat, instead of davening b'tzibor without your hat. On that, Rav Shlomo Zalman seems to be chaylik, and he says that davening b'tzibor is daicha the inyanim of lavush for tefillah. Right? So there are inyanim that even if tefillah b'tzibor is a chayva, there are some inyanim that may set it aside. People also ask a different type of question: what about going on vacation? It's a big problem. People, maybe in Eretz Yisrael, maybe it's a little less of a problem because most places there'll be a minyan somewhere. But a person likes to go camping, hiking, right? So they go to, let's say in the States, they go to Yellowstone National Park, Yosemite, all of these different places. All right, and they take kosher food, they load their car with everything. So food they'll have, but minyan they're not going to have in all probability, unless you have a large family. If you have 9 bar mitzvah kids, all right, so you'll have a minyan. But usually, and even then, do you have your own sefer Torah? Even then it's not so precious. You'll have everything. So, I myself know. I myself am not a hiker, so I have not done this. But I myself know chashuva people. I know a chashuva Talmid Chacham, Zichrono Livrach. He's not alive anymore, but in Baltimore, who his big thing was. And he mamish was a person who was, Yeshiv Isaac B'Torah, like, Yom V'Layla, but his big thing was, for 10 days a year, he took his whole family on a camping trip, and that was their big thing. And I'm pretty sure, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, I'm pretty sure they didn't have a minyan. So the interesting question is, are you allowed to go on vacation when you are not going to have a minyan? You're going to be mevatel tefillah b'tzibur. So it's interesting like this. The Gemara itself says, if you're yaitse laderech, now the Gemara is not talking about tiyulim, it's talking about, but if you're traveling, and there's no minyan, so the halacha is, you're not mechuyev to go. So if there's a minyan in the direction you're going, so you're mechuyev to wait ad kedei 4 mil, meaning the amount of time it takes to walk 4 mil. Now, again, it's interesting how you compute this. A mil is 2,000 amos, which we will say is approximately a kilometer. So 4 mil is 4 kilometers. Now, how long does it take to walk 4 kilometers? So Chazal are Meshayer that 18 minutes per mil. So 4 mil is 72 minutes. So that means, assuming I'm not going to be over Zaman Tefillah, if in the direction I'm going, there will be a minyan within 72 minutes, right? So it's not even, see, again, it's interesting. The share of 4 mil is measured by time, not measured by distance. Because if you're driving, in 72 minutes, you could go 20 miles. More than that, you can go 50 miles, right? So it's interesting. We're looking not at the distance, we're looking at the time it would take to walk 4 mil, which is 72 minutes. So you're mechuyev to drive 72 minutes. Now it's interesting, it's not clear how that applies. I mean, usually, if you're on a highway, there's not going to be a shul on the highway. There's a shul, ahead of me. But I have to go into town. Right? So there's a machlekes how you compute that, if you compute that at all. Is that because, by definition, that's going out of your way. Even if it's in the direction you're going, it's out of your way. But assuming, just to keep it simple, if it's lefanav, the shear is 4 mil. If it's li'achurav, the shear is only 1 mil. So if I could get to a minyan within 18 minutes of where I am, I got to go backwards. If I can't get it within 18 minutes, I don't. So the truth of the matter is, if I'm in Yosemite National Park, and the closest minyan is 3 hours away, I'm vadai not mechuyev then to go 3 hours. Right, that's for sure. So in a sense, I am putter from tefillah b'tzibur when I'm in a matzav where daled milin lefanav, there's no minyan, and mil acharav, there's no minyan. So one could argue that, hey, by definition, there's nothing wrong with my being a traveler because I'm going to be putter from tefillah b'tzibur b'chiyai gavna. The problem is, are you allowed to put yourself in the matzav? See, that's the problem. Meaning, once you're there, you're putter. But what's your heter to put yourself? The Gemara is talking about a guy had to go, whatever it is. It was a vital business decision or something like that. But if it's mamish, just for recreation. So it's an interesting halacha. You are putter once you're in Yosemite National Park. You are putter because it's not within the distances that are mechayev you to go. The question is, what's the heter? So people say, it may sound like too much of a subjective heter, but they say that if they really need this to recharge their batteries, and otherwise they're not going to be able to learn well, and their davening throughout the year is going to be shvacher, and this is something that is machasik them, so they say that's considered to be a tzarich mitzvah. They give the same heter, by the way, to a more general question. Forget about tefillah b'tzibur. People routinely, many people, go to chutz la'aretz for vacation. A person might go to somewhere. Now the question is, you're not allowed to leave Eretz Yisrael. Right? Shlomo Zalman would never left Eretz Yisrael. He would not leave. If he had an einikal that was getting married in London, he did not go to the wedding. He held you don't leave Eretz Yisrael. But most of us would leave for an einikal's wedding. Right? So the halacha is you're allowed to leave l'tzarich mitzvah. Tzorich mitzvah you can leave. Kibbud aviyim, right? So you can visit your parents. Kibbud aviyim. Huh? So that might be. I mean, to go to a chasna. Oh, I didn't. Okay. It probably does. I mean, he was machmer. He didn't. Whatever. Even though l'chayra, he's being machmer and by giving up the simcha of his presence. Okay, I hear. But people say that for people who need the break and need the vacation, the tiyul itself has the halacha of a tzorich mitzvah. Yeah, it seems like a stretch, but there is such a svara that achrayim say if a person really needs it. The question is, why do I need the Grand Canyon? Why can't I go, somewhere here? Oh, okay, that's a question. But the Grand Canyon is different, whatever it is. So the interesting point that I'm making is that the Graz Hagdara, that you should find your own derech, but you have to be careful that it's not keneged halacha, requires you to be a shtickle Talmud Chacham. What is keneged halacha? What is not keneged halacha? Right? A person might say, "Oh, when I go to the Grand Canyon, my sense of godless habore is so increased, and I daven with more kavana." All of that is emes, but are you allowed to be mavatal tefillah b'tzibur? So again, I'm not giving you a psak. There are different dayas in this, but that would be the type of cheshbon that a person has to have. And as I say, the whole not just Shar Aleph, but most of Nefesh HaChaim is really, if you ask a question, like why did Rav Chaim Volozhiner write Nefesh HaChaim? There's a lot of important things in Nefesh HaChaim, right? Many important Yesodis, but like what was the lachatz? Rav Chaim Volozhiner was a Gadol Hador. He had chidushim on all of Shas. He had Shilas Tshuvas. He had, all sorts of things. The one sefer he told his son to be sure to publish was Nefesh HaChaim. He says, that has kedima over my chidushim, over my Shilas Tshuvas. In fact, most of that is lost. We don't even have that much. I mean, there was a lot of stuff, and somehow it got lost after his death. So what was this thing about Nefesh HaChaim? Like, why? So the truth of the matter is, Nefesh HaChaim historically was written at the early years of Hasidus. And in the early, and it's a very gentle anti-Hasidic work, a gentle anti-Hasidic work. That doesn't mean anti-everything. The Tanya also is an anti-Hasidic work in a sense, although it's a Hasidic work. And because the early teaching of Hasidus was that the most important thing in Avodas Hashem is panemius. Panemius. Your avas Hashem, your yiras Hashem, your passion, your excitement, your geschmack. And if you do mitzvahs without feeling and you do it superficially, it's worthless, it doesn't count. Hashem doesn't want that avodah. And they brought all sorts of rayas to this idea. So the Gra felt, although of course there's a lot of truth in that. Of course the Navi Yeshayahu criticizes people who do mitzvahs. Mitzvahs anashim ilumada, you're just doing it because of habit. Of course that's true. But the problem is there was a sakana atzuma that the Gra felt, and that is people will no longer, or might not pay attention to the pratim of halacha if they feel those pratim are taking away the intensity of my kavanah. So a person might say, for example, I want to fast on Shabbos because I have more kavanah when I don't eat. Or a person might miss Siman Kriya Shema because I'll have more kavanah if I say Shema at 11 o'clock in the morning instead of 7 o'clock. In other words, or Pumfiket, or a person might say, I'm not going to learn Torah because my heart is not passionately aflame with ruchnius. So what's the use? My Torah is worthless. So as a result, what Rav Chaim Volozhiner wanted to do in the Nefesh HaChaim was to emphasize the importance of Maisa, the importance of Halacha, the importance that a Maisa HaMitzvah KaHalacha has a tremendous spiritual kayach, even if you're not yet on the Madrega where you have all of the Kavanas. So Hasidus was emphasizing Kavana, possibly at the expense of the Dikdukim of Halacha. So Rav Chaim Volozhiner wrote the corrective, so to speak, that you have to emphasize the halacha. And that's why, one of the points that one notices in the Nefesh HaChaim is how many rayas from the Zohar Rav Chaim Volozhiner brings. Raya after raya after raya after raya. I know your son goes through each of those rayas. And like one wonders, it's almost like Rav Chaim Volozhiner is over-proving things. You have to bring 10 Zohars to make a point that doing the mitzvah right is important. But the reason is, again, this had direct kavanah, because the Hasidic Shita was largely based on Kabbalah, because there are many, many mamorim in the Zohar that talk about Avos Hashem and Yiras Hashem. The famous Zohar are the two wings that lift your mitzvahs from the ground and bring them to Shemayim. So they were proving it from Zohar. So Rav Chaim had to show from the Zohar Gufa the importance of Maisa. Because if he just would have shown it from the Gemara, so they would, we're looking at Kabbalah. Even though that would have been a mistake too, but then we're looking at Kabbalah, don't bother me with Gemara. So he had to kind of use their Makairis to establish his particular point. By the way, the Tanya does very much the same. People don't realize that the Tanya was attacked not only by Misnagdim for the Hasidic stuff in the Tanya. It was attacked by Hasidim, because the Alter Rebbe talks a lot about the importance of Limud HaTorah and a lot about the importance of Diktuk in Halacha. And some Hasidim thought, hey, you're de-emphasizing the Iker Yesodus of the Baal Shem Tov. That's why they say, it's interesting, when the Baal Shem Tov died, the Hasidic movement, so to speak, was very small. Maybe there were 100 Hasidim. I mean, it wasn't a big thing. The one who really made Hasidus a gigantic movement was the successor to the Baal Shem Tov, Rav Dov Ber, the Mezritcher Maggid. And what he did was, it's like he drew a map of Europe, different countries, Ukraine, Russia, Poland, Hungary, and he assigned different Talmidim to kind of take over that country and bring Hasidus to that country. So, for example, the Breitowitz was Levi Yitzchak Breitowitz was Ukraine, etc. So, the hardest country to crack was Lithuania. How do you do Hasidus in Lithuania? Lithuania, the Moreshus of the Gra and rationality. Even in Yiddish we have the expression a kalte Litvak, a cold Litvak. They don't go for emotionality and all of that stuff. So the one who was given the assignment to establish Hasidus in Lita was Rav Shneur Zalman of Liadi, called the Alter Rebbe, the first Rebbe of Chabad. He was called the Litvak because of all of the Gedolei Hasidus. He was the strongest mamish in Shas and Poskim. He was mamish Agadol in Shas and Poskim. And what is his movement called? Whatever it became today is a separate issue, but Chabad, Chochma, Bina, Das. It was an intellectual, philosophical Hasidus, not so much an emotional Hasidus. Again, whether it's still that way today is another question, but certainly the yesod of Chabad was Chabad, Chachma, Bina, V'das. So, as a result, a lot of the things of the Alter Rebbe overlap with Rav Chaim Volozhiner. It's very, very fascinating that the Tanya and the Nefesh HaChaim, there are some differences, but Lamaisa, a lot of it walks together. The importance of Limud HaTorah, the importance of Diktuk in Halacha Lamaisa, and not allowing your ruchnius to depart from the framework of Halacha, exactly what the Gra is saying here. And again, Nefesh HaChaim is an expansion of this idea. So the truth of the matter is that the Baal Tanya was the closest to a misnaged that a chassid could be. In fact, when the Baal Tanya was a young man, he was debating which Rebbe he should go to. At some point in his life, he was debating, should he become a Talmud of the Vilna Gaon, or should he become a Talmud of the Maggid of Mezritch? And he was mamish mesupik which way to go. At the end, he decided to go to the Maggid of Mezritch, but he still was Litvish in a lot of his things. He wrote the Shulchan Aruch Harav, the Rav Shulchan Aruch, which is a big, major source of psak. The Mishnah Berurah brings it all the time. Right, this is Shulchan Aruch Harav. It's a makubal. In Chabad, of course, that's definitive. But even if for people who are not Chabad, it's one of the Gedolei HaPoskim that every posek reckons with the Shulchan Aruch Harav. Yeah.
How come they don't go like some of the halachas he fastens, like so that's just for example, he fastens?
Yeah. That's very, very interesting. I'm sure there are more, but there are two well-known halachas that Chabad does not follow the psak of the Alter Rebbe. One is Suda Shlishis, where the Alter Rebbe brings the regular halacha of the Shulchan Aruch, that you have to have 3 meals, and l'chatchila it should be on bread. And the other is sleeping in the sukkah. Again, the Shulchan Aruch Paskin, it's like the Mishnah says, that unless you're patur because of mitzvah or something, you're supposed to sleep in the sukkah. And yet, Chabad Bisman Hazeh does not have a Suda. Now, they say they eat a fruit, they eat an apple or something, but they're not koveya on bread, a Suda Shalishis. And they have a very strong shita not to sleep in the sukkah. They don't just say, you're patur because it's Crown Heights and there's crime. That would be simple. They could say, it's dangerous. Okay. No, they have a shita that sleeping is not proper because the sukkah is kadosh, and how dare you allow your holy neshama to just leave your body. In other words, it's very schwer because they're saying it's wrong to sleep in the sukkah, when the law of sukkah is not only in the Shulchan Aruch, but the law of sleeping in the sukkah is the Mishnah itself. So it's very, very schwer. I actually saw Litvish Rosh Hashiva from Eretz Yisrael, and this is the long. Normally, when the Rebbe had these lines, each person, would have like 2 seconds or 5 seconds. So this Litvish Rav Rosh Hashiva asked the Rebbe. He says, "I have to ask the Rebbe a question about not sleeping in the Sukkah Shmini." He says, the Rebbe got so upset. He kept the guy for 25 minutes, like giving him musar and saying that, And there was a big line, waiting here, holding up a line for 25 minutes. But sof kol sof, l'maisa, the Rebbe didn't give a teretz to it. So I don't know. I mean, he gave the guy musar for asking the question, and it's a chutzpah, and zgarim sinas chinam, and pirut, and all sorts of things. So I don't know. I don't know exactly all of the cheshbainis. But you are correct. There are some hachraot of the Alter Rebbe that the later Rebbeim of Chabad did not always follow. Okay, alrighty. So now let's look at Sif Hey. Hamidais Haim Lefi Teva Haguf Vahanefesh Umish. Now this is a very interesting parenthesis. Umishtanim Lefi Maasehem Begilgal Harishain. So these are two separate things here. The first thing is that a person is born with a certain nature. The midas are according to the teva, the nature of your guf and of your nefesh. Now this is again hard to understand this exactly. According to Kabbalah, and the Gemara goes with this Kabbalah over and over again, what we call the neshama, or the soul of a person, has many components. There are actually 5 parts of the soul. I'll use the English word soul. The lowest part is called the nefesh. The nefesh is the animal soul, the biological soul. That's what keeps me physically alive. So even if a person's in a coma and he doesn't necessarily have connection to these higher levels, there is a nefesh. Right? So the nefesh is the part that keeps the guf operating. And then there is something higher that's called the ruach. The ruach are the source of emotion and feeling. And then there is the neshama, which is the seichel and the intellect. Okay, and this is often abbreviated naran. Nefesh, ruach, neshama, going from lower to higher. And then what happens is, those are the chalokim of the neshama that are encased within your guf. Right? Your guf is the malbush of the nefesh, ruach, neshama, the biological, the animal, the emotive, and the intellectual. Then outside of you, there is an ohr, a divine light, that's makif, that surrounds you, connecting you to Hashem, and that comprises two levels. There is what is called the chaya, and then there is what is called yechida, which is the singular point of deepest connection to Hashem. The chaya and the yechida are not really within us, it is without us, it's outside of us. And the way Rav Chaim Volozhiner describes it, although others do not say it this way, you're not always in contact with it. It's almost as if when your neshama is functioning at its highest level, it kind of bubbles up and touches the chaya yechida. It makes a connection. And then you have this shefa of divinity that goes in. But other times, it's like around you, but it's not really touching you. It's like your neshama will be the contact to the chaya yechida and the light. So the Gemara tells us here that the midas are a teva. Now he says teva haguf hanefesh. Now I always have a little bit of a problem here. Does the guf have any particular nature at all? In other words, the guf is simply inert. The guf is dead. The guf is like the table. It's the nefesh of the guf that represents a person's life. So I'm not sure how much to be medayak here. He says the midas are located, so to speak, in the guf, according to a teva, in the guf and the nefesh. I would interpret this to mean the nefesh that controls the guf, not that the guf has some autonomy. And then you'll remember, although he doesn't say it here, but you'll remember in the Hakdama, Rav Shmuel Malson brings from the Sharei Kedusha of Rav Chaim Vital that the midas come from the four elements which comprise, maybe that's why he means the guf and the nefesh, of the Yesod HaMayim, Yesod HaEsh, Yesod HaOfer, Yesod HaRuach. So remember that from the Eish comes the midas of anger and gaiva, and from the Ruach is Devarim Batelim, and from the Mayim is Taiva, and from the Ofor is laziness, as well as self-loathing or depression, right? So from these different Yesodos come the Midos Ros, or Midos Tovos, and the like. So the point is, you are born a certain way, right? So the midas you are born with, whether they're good or bad. But then, in parentheses, he makes a very interesting point that, in a sense, what you're born with were not necessarily the innate qualities of your neshama, because you're not here for the first time. In other words, if we were to simply say you're born a certain way, and you were never born before, then I would have to say, Hashem takes your neshama out of the factory, and your neshama has these certain qualities, and he sticks it in the body. And then you have to work on it. But it's not true that what I'm born with was the innate quality of my soul, because if I have been here in prior incarnations, Gilgal, reincarnation, then in a sense, the second time I'm born, I'm not just getting the innate qualities that came out of the factory, I'm getting the qualities that were developed by the maisim that I did in the Gilgal Rishon. You hear what I'm saying? In other words, and by the way, this is for good or for bad. I keep on using examples of bad midos, but it also works for good midos. In other words, a person's midos, let's say in my own life, let's look at one Gilgal, let's look at this life. In this life, my midos are a combination of what I'm born with and what I acquire by virtuous action. Or the other way around, or sinful action. Meaning, your maisim can improve your midos, or your maisim can ruin your midos. So the Gra is making an interesting subtlety that the midos that you were born with are also a function of your actions in the earlier Gilgal. So the first time your soul was put into a body, the midos you're born with came out of the factory. And Hashem chose, for whatever reason, to be matbiya, certain midos in certain neshamas, or nefesh, we don't know why. But once you're past the first Gilgul, then the midos are not only the things that were in your teva to begin with, but they are in fact, and as we're carrying baggage basically, that when I'm born the second time, some of the midos I'm born with were the midos that resulted from the maisim that I did in the previous Gilgul. So, if those maisim were good, then Baruch Hashem, I'm born with a head start. If the maisim were bad, unfortunately, I'm born with a deficit. So we have no way of knowing. In fact, it's interesting. For some reason, I don't have a clear raya about this. First of all, I just want to just point out this thing about Gilgul. Do you have to believe in Gilgul Bichlal? Right? You have to believe in Gilgul. So it's interesting that not all the Rishonim Bichlal believed in Gilgul. Rav Sadra Gaon, in his Sefer Amunas V'Deis, it's one of the great books of Jewish philosophy, Rav Sadra Gaon, before the Rambam, actually says that there's no such thing as Gilgul. I mean, he recognizes the belief in it, but he says no such thing in Torah, and anyone that teaches Gilgul borrowed it from non-Jewish religious systems, and it is not part of Judaism at all. That's what Rav Sadra Gaon says. The Rambam, I think, says nothing about Gilgul, but my guess is he probably did not believe it either. On the other hand, Ramban actually very much talks about Gilgul. In fact, Ramban understands. The Ramban has a parish on Sefer Iyov. Now, the book of Iyov is all about the issue of why do tzaddikim suffer in the world. Right? A person's a tzaddik. Why should all these bad things happen? And Hashem comes to Iyov at the end of the Sefer and gives him an explanation, but it's very hard to know what Hashem is saying. The explanation is very shver. It's not clear. So the Ramban learns that the explanation is sometimes what happens to a tzaddik is because of a past life. That even if the tzaddik has no averos, but there needs to be a kapara for the averos of past life, and the Ramban looks at the whole yesod of Gilgul from Sefer Iyov. Right? So it's mamish mikatza lakatza. Rav Sadra Gaon says no such thing. Ramban says Gilgul is the yesod of Sefer Iyov. And of course the Zohar is filled with inyanim of Gilgul. And the Arizal, right? Rav Chaim, the Arizal did not write that much. He wrote very little. A few things there he wrote, but very, very little. 95% of what we call Kisvei Ha'ari are not Kisvei Ha'ari, they are the Kisvei Rav Chaim Vital, who wrote over the Ari. And one of Rav Chaim Vital's Sfarim is Shar HaGilgulim, in which he goes over Gilgul. He goes over all of the inyanim of Gilgul, and even, this is the part people like, it's a hard sefer. People think it's entertaining sefer. Shar HaGilgul is a very, very difficult sefer. But there is part of it that people find entertaining in the sense that he identifies all sorts of great people who were Gilgulim of earlier people. So that people find very, very interesting. Well, I'll give you one little example of this. Hitainas Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah was a Gilgul of Shmuel Haramasi, Shmuel Hanavi. Where does he get that? Because Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah became Nasi at the age of 18, and his beard turned white. Remember, it's in the Haggadah, it's Mishnah Brachos, and he said, "Behold, Harei Ani Keven Shivim Shana." I am like a man that is 70, and I wasn't able to know the halacha that you got to mention Yetzias Rayim at night until Ben Zoma made a drasha. So the Gemara says, why does he say I'm like a person that's 70? Because he was actually 18, but when Rabbi Gamliel was deposed, they couldn't decide, because of his insult of Rabbi Yoshua, they couldn't decide who should be Nasi. So Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah was like the dark horse, kind of the unknown candidate that they chose. But people wouldn't respect him, so he had to look old, prematurely old. My wife always has another pshat. She says that when he had the responsibility of being a Nasi, it turned his beard white. She points out that a lot of our friends who didn't become shul rabbis, they still have a black beard, whatever. Okay, so that could be true. That could be true also. But the Arizal says, interesting pshat, that he was a Gilgal. Now, Shmuel Haramasi died at the age of 52, very young. So when Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah was born, he was given the neshama that had spent 52 years on earth. So when he was 18, now my soul has lived on earth for 70 years. Harei ani kaven shivim shana. So that's the Shar HaGilgulim of Rav Chaim Vital. So all I can say is that obviously the Arizal held of Gilgulim, Rav Chaim Vital, the Ramchal, and the Gra. So they all held of this idea of Gilgulim very, very much. But I don't think you could characterize it as an Iker Emuna, meaning to say, if a person were to say he doesn't believe in Techiyas HaMesim, that would be Kfira. If a person says he doesn't believe in Gilgal, we would say it's mistaken because our Gedolei Yisrael have endorsed him. But I don't think you could call it an Iker Emuna if Rav Sadia Gaon held it was not. But again, how you understand how Rav Sadia Gaon could make a mistake, that's difficult for us to understand. But there were different shitas. So the Gra here is saying an interesting point, that even the midas you're born with are not necessarily your natural midas. They are midas that you may have acquired through your actions in an earlier Gilgal. That itself is quite interesting, that there's going to be a ration from that past life in how you start off in the second life. Now, this thing about Gilgal, there's a whole, I don't know if I would call it a science, some will call it a pseudoscience, but of near-death experiences or past life regression, where people under hypnosis or other situations, they can recall prior lives. They can recall they were a Holocaust victim, or they could recall, being a concert pianist somewhere. They mamish can recall another life. And there are books about this called Past Life Regression. Yeah, a near-death experience is something else. That's when people experience going to heaven, and that's a separate thing. But this is past life regression. In fact, a frum woman in the Old City wrote a whole book about children who remember being victims in the Holocaust. They mamish remember a lot of things. So some want to say that that's a raya to the idea of Gilgal, that people remember past lives. But I heard from my own Rosh Hashiva, of Shmuel Yaakov Weinberg, although he said it in passing, I didn't hear the rayas or anything. He said that there's no way that your conscious mind can recall that prior existence, meaning the Gilgal leaves a reshim on your midas, but it does not leave a reshim in your memory. Your memory is legamre erased. I don't know what the raya is, and I don't see a hechrech for that, and I don't see logically why it has to be that way. But he tainted by definition, any memory of a past life is not a Gilgal, and sometimes it can just be the imagination, meaning the way the mind works is very strange. Like somebody saw a picture of the Holocaust and it gets turned into, the way dreams work, that you see a picture, whatever it is, and your mind makes it into a story, and it does not refer necessarily to a life. But again, as I say, I don't know what the Rosh Hashiva's raya was, and I don't see why it's a mukhrich svara, but this I do know that he said that there cannot be a conscious memory of a Gilgal. By the way, the Gra says elsewhere, and I think it's going to be put down in the Evan Shelaima Vaiteran, that strange thing, that if you stole from somebody and you weren't Meshiv Gezela, you will have to come back as a Gilgal. Okay, that's your problem. But the guy that you stole from will have to come back as a Gilgal, so you could be Masakin by somehow giving it back to him. And that's a tremendous sar, because the neshama does not want to come back as a Gilgal. So it's almost as if you victimized them more. In other words, when you steal from somebody, not only have you victimized them by stealing, you victimize them that you've created a need for them to come back as a Gilgal. In fact, it's brought down that when a neshama after death is given a choice to go the Gilgal or the Gehenna, the neshama chooses Gehenna. Sometimes it's not given a choice, but if it's given a choice, it would rather go to Gehenna than come back to this earth. Okay, so the midas are according to the teva of the guf and the nefesh, and umishtanim, and those midas can change according to the maisim in Gilgal Rishon. By the way, I'm translating Gilgal Rishon, not the first Gilgal, but the prior Gilgal. So if it's number 5, then number 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, we'll leave a Rishon as well. V'hamaisim heim lefi ruach. So this is very interesting. The midas are mushrash in your nefesh, but your maisim are in control of your ruach, which is actually very true. Remember, the nefesh is the animal soul, the biological soul. But the ratzain of a person is primarily his emotional state. Now, it's true, the neshama is the seichel. The neshama is the ultimate thing that knows right and wrong. But you can have a lot of seichel and a lot of understanding, but if you don't have the emotional ratzain, you're not going to do it. So it's interesting that the midas are the nefesh, but the ruach determines your maisim. Because the reason is, the ruach is the source of ratzain. Ratzain, where do I want to go? So now, he uses a mashal. You've probably heard this mashal before, but it's from the Gaon, the famous horse and rider mashal. Uchamo shahareichev al hasus. When you ride a horse, Yachol lahachricho leilech b'derech hayosher al yidei yagia. Even if the horse is a wild horse, and the horse wants to go all sorts of ways, if you know how to control the horse, you keep it on the road. Afim hususra, even if it's a disobedient horse or a wild horse. Kain, af mi shenafshay ra b'teva midosaha. Even if in a person's nefesh there are naturally bad midas, ha'ikar taloi baruach. Your ratzain, there's a manual override. Your ratzain could direct the horse into the paths that it needs to go. Okay, the horse and the rider. Yeah, the horse b'derech hateva will go wherever it wants to go, but the rider can direct it. The ruach is the rider of the horse. Okay, so that's the important point, that you can train the horse, right? An experienced rider can train the horse. See, I remember the last time I was on a horse. It's amazing. It was maybe 15 years ago, and they gave me like the oldest, slowest horse they could possibly find. And I tell you, I was scared to death. The thing was probably going, 1 mile an hour or something, but it was scary. I felt I couldn't control it. And the thing is, this is the way horses know. Horses know when the rider doesn't know what he's doing. Right? The horse is margish, just like a dog. A dog also. A dog knows when, it can do what it wants and the master's not going to do anything. So the nature of the Yetzer Hara is that if the Ratzon is not there and the Ruach is not stark, the Yetzer Hara gets more and more miskaber because it knows that you have no way of controlling it. But the Yesod is the other way around, that the Iker is Taloi Baruach. And let's do one more. Mitzad ha'gufa ha'nefesh, ha'adam hu garua mikol chai. When you look at your biological self, your animal self, we're by and large very inferior to animals. Animals can run faster. They're much stronger. They can climb trees. An animal can do anything better than a human on a physical level. So in terms of the guf and the nefesh, we are garua mikol chai. So what is our greatness? Mitzad haruach v'haneshama. Gadol mikuba. The ruach is the will, the ratzon, and the neshama is the seichel. That is our greatness. Our greatness is the ruach and the neshama that can control the guf and the nefesh. But here's an important point to keep on. When I say control, control is not just control. Control is also re-educate and train. It's very different. In other words, instead of saying, oh, my nefesh will always, be bad, but I'm going to rein it in. That may be how you start. But what eventually happens is there's a training process here. Now, the Baal Tanya has the same lashon here. Not the same lashon, the same concept. He expresses it differently. Hamoach sholet al halev. The mind must rule over the passions. Now, that can take two forms. The passions want to do this bad thing, but I hold it in. But on a deeper level, you re-educate the horse, you re-educate the dog, that it wants to do good things. And therefore, eventually, instead of struggling with bad midos, the bad midos become good midos, right? That's the ultimate goal in all of this. Okay, so that's the idea that our godless is mitzad the ruach and the neshama. Rav Schiller, should be well, often gives a very nice mashal. He says, we know that free will is the great thing of man, right? The great thing, the great kayach of the human being is bechira. So what's bechira? So everybody says, bechira is you can choose to do whatever you want to do. He says, that's not bechira. I mean, every animal can choose what it wants to do. Bechira is the capacity to choose to do what you don't want to do, or to choose not to do what you want to do. That's bechira. The bechira is to override the passions and the emotions. To follow the passions and the emotions is not really bechira, because you're simply hijacked by those forces, right? So it's interesting. Bechira is not, I can do whatever I want. Bechira is, I can decide not to do what I want to do, or do what I don't want to do. That is true bechira. Okay, be well. Shabbat.